Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs, and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Where did Evan go? Yeah, that'd be fine. Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna try to remember to stay. I want to get the question started probably like 20 minutes before we end, which would be 2:50. So maybe like a 20-minute one.
He's given us a signal.
Oh, okay. Okay, good afternoon. Today is Thursday, April 13th, 2023. It's 2 p.m. and this is panel number 17843, Protecting Our Planet and Our Health. My name is Kristopher Karnauskas, and I'll be serving as the moderator for this panel. I'm an associate professor of atmospheric and oceanic sciences here at CU Boulder. I have a secondary faculty appointment within the Colorado School of Public Health, and I'm the co-chair of the joint U.S. CLIVAR NIH Working Group on Climate and Health. Today we would like to acknowledge that Boulder is on the ancestral homelands and unceded territory of indigenous peoples who have traversed, lived in, and stewarded lands in the Boulder Valley since time immemorial. Those indigenous nations include the Apache, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Pawnee, Shoshone, Sioux, and Ute. Just a word about the Q&A. We're going to reserve time at the end of the discussion for Q&A. We're going to use a note card system to receive questions from the audience. So if you'd like to pose a question, simply raise your hand at any time and during the session request a note card and pencil from one of our producers who will come and bring that to you. Please write legibly, and if you're a student, please note this in your question on the card. And when you finish writing your question, please raise your hand and hand the card back to the producer who will bring it up to me. And I urge everybody to please make your questions brief and to the point, and I may not be able to ask all the questions submitted, and I may combine similar questions. So I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists we have up here. Dr. Juan Aguilera, MD, PhD, and MPH, is an assistant professor at the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston, working at the regional campus in El Paso. Dr. Aguilera earned his doctorate degree in interdisciplinary health sciences from the University of Texas El Paso. While at UTEP, he served as the coordinator for the evidence-based screenings for obesity, cardiorespiratory disease, and environmental exposures in low-income El Paso households research project, where he applies his background in medicine and public health. Dr. Karen Bailey, PhD, is an assistant professor of environmental studies here at CU Boulder. Dr. Bailey is a social environmental scientist interested in the ways humans interact with their environments. She's especially interested in how human relationships with the environment are disrupted by global change processes like climate and land use change. Dr. Bailey's dissertation focused on climate and environmental change, human livelihoods, and well-being in Southern Africa. Dr. Caitling Rubee, MD, MPH, is an assistant professor of emergency medicine in the Department of Emergency Medicine at the University of Colorado School of Medicine and Colorado School of Public Health, previously completing the Climate Change and Health Science Policy Fellowship, also here at the University of Colorado. Dr. Rubee's research addresses the climate crisis through health policy and an evidence-informed practice. She has been a national and international leader in advocating for physician engagement in communicating climate change and health with public audiences and diverse sectors with professional organizations and government agencies. And finally, Dr. Evan Thomas, PhD, PEMPH, is a professor of civil, environmental, and architectural engineering, as well as aerospace engineering sciences here at CU Boulder. Dr. Thomas is also the director of the Mortensen Center in Global Engineering and Resilience, the Global Engineering Residential Academic Program, and the CU Boulder Climate Innovation Collaboratory. Dr. Thomas's technical background is in water and air testing and treatment applied in contexts ranging from emerging economies to operational spacecraft. He founded a company called Viridi, which is monitoring millions of people's water supply across East Africa daily. And right now I'd like to give each panelist 3 to 5 minutes to give some opening remarks. Please begin.
Thank you so much, and thank you, everybody. I think this is a wonderful opportunity for us to have open discussion, while at the same time sharing a little bit of our stories. And I'm just happy to see the engagement that the CWA has shown throughout all the panels this morning. For me, as a personal experience, I started as a physician in Mexico, but then had the opportunity to come to the US to focus more on public health. And to be honest, I was really surprised about the need for more infrastructure regarding access to healthcare. And this is how I met a professor that was serving the community, doing a health fair project in which we will assess the community needs, but at the same time also look at the built environment. And he was researching air pollution. And for me, it was surprising because I was like, okay, are we focusing on cardiovascular disease, obesity, or air pollution? What do they have to do with each other? And I was just surprised at how the emerging literature has shown how the built environment is so important for our overall health. And this was about 10 years ago. So I continued this journey of public health. I had the opportunity to continue his work, and eventually led the project as a student, where we serve about 6,000 people in El Paso while assessing the built environment, the air pollution, the amount of traffic they're exposed to, and how it would relate to their health. In a sense, we were looking at metabolic diseases, things like obesity, blood sugar, high blood pressure, and how living in an environment where you're exposed to pollution, if you're exposed to low impacts of physical activity, you don't have access to places where to work out or places to have a good and proper nutrition, are gonna also affect your health overall. So this led me to do work also at Stanford, where we were looking at health related to smoke exposure to wildfire. And as you all know, with climate change, we're starting to see more these effects of wildfire pollution. And through some of those projects, we're now focusing on, okay, it's not only the amount of pollution that's present, but also what's burning. What is the composition of these particles and how they're gonna start affecting our health overall. So after that experience, I'm just happy that I had the opportunity to come back to El Paso and apply those experiences back to serving the community, but also to share that with you all and look for common grounds in which how can we turn all this experience into actionable items. So thank you to everybody for being here.
Dr. Bailey?
Yeah, I'm going to follow suit a little bit and talk about sort of my trajectory and my pathway here as well. I'm originally from Los Angeles, California, and I grew up in a family and community that had a strong emphasis on social justice and community service. We did a lot of work with low-income communities of color, with unhoused populations, and a lot of work around social justice. Around that, through all of my upbringing and sort of while I was being raised in that sort of environment, I was always really interested in animals and in wildlife. And so I ended up choosing to study ecology and evolutionary biology in undergraduate school and graduate school and beyond. And there came this point where I was doing my dissertation research, which was mentioned in Southern Africa, in Eswatini specifically. It used to be called Swaziland. They changed their name to Eswatini to rather move away from the colonial English language name. But I was there really studying wildlife, and I was studying rodents in particular, and small mammals, and how their roles in the ecosystems varied across the protected areas and these large-scale sugarcane plantations, and then people's farmlands and grazing lands. And while I was there, it was during one of the worst droughts in southern Africa in recent memory. One of the worst droughts really in recorded history. And so food security was incredibly low at the time. And so I found myself doing ecological research, trapping rodents in a place where the cows were dying around me, right? The maize fields were dying around me. And just thinking about this relationship more meaningfully, while I was there, I was sort of reflecting on my experiences growing up in South Central Los Angeles, my mom's experience growing up low income in Tennessee, and really just thinking about the shared negative, harmful relationships that marginalized communities often have as a result of environmental degradation. And really thinking about how the communities in Southern Africa that I was working with were experiencing many of the same harms from the environment as the communities that I grew up in and that my parents grew up in. And so I found myself a little bit angry that my ecological education hadn't made these connections real up to this point. So I had a little bit of a crisis of faith. I told my advisor that I wanted to study people. That was fun. He was very supportive, and I'm ever grateful to him to this day. But I decided to study the drought itself, how people were responding to the drought, and how that was changing their relationships with the environment and their connections to the environment. And that's really, that experience is what informs the work that I do today, really thinking about human-environment interactions and human well-being. I often don't use the word health, perhaps problematically, in the work that I do, but I think about well-being in part because I'm not a trained medical professional. But what I also think about my work is really facilitating joyful relationships between people in their environments, right? How can we understand human needs, understand environmental sustainability in a way that facilitates joy, right? That spreads joy. And so the way that's manifested in my work is a lot of research around climate adaptation and resilience, but really how both climate change and the efforts we take to adapt to climate change might be disrupting some of those relationships with the environment. And how can we think about human well-being broadly defined, abstractly defined, when we're thinking about climate change and climate adaptation? So we're doing some work here in Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah with reservoir communities that are experiencing drought and water scarcity. And we're trying to understand this concept of sense of place. How is your connection to the landscape being interrupted? How is your connection to your community? How is your connection to yourself and your family history being impacted by drought, by low levels of water on the landscape? So just as an example, sort of my trajectory to where I am and how I think about human well-being in the context of environmental health as well.
My journey to the climate crisis was a little bit later. So I am an emergency medicine physician by day and by night. And so part of my training and growth was always centered on this aspect of community health and well-being. So it was really patients who showed me that we need to take a much stronger stance when it comes to the climate crisis. I was in my training in Ohio, and at that time, I was seeing emergency departments in rural areas being flooded and all of the patients having to be transported to our main unit at an academic institution. I was seeing patients affected by the very places where they lived. So place is a powerful driver of health. Patients would come in not being able to breathe clean air, not drinking clean water, being affected by the global spread of diseases from mosquitoes and ticks and other bugs that are being enhanced in the setting of climate change. It was really their stories that drove me to act. If we think about heat as the most fundamental aspect, caring for someone with heat stroke or the most life-threatening condition related to climate change takes an entire team of people. 15 people in a trauma resuscitation bay. Me, certainly as a physician, but respiratory therapists, nurses, pharmacists, technicians, and many others who are trying to cool an entire human body within 30 minutes, much less a waiting room full of 50 or 100 other people with emergent conditions. And so for me, thinking about a warming planet, it was really about what opportunities and transformations can we make right now in order to better cool these people faster, to better prepare our communities centered on health and justice, especially those most impacted. One of the key tenets of being an emergency physician is we care for anyone at any time for any concern. And so that means people who are unsheltered, people who are going through a difficult financial time, people who are in formerly redlined areas due to historic housing policies by no fault of their own, are at increased risk of getting really sick, secondary to these climate-related exposures. And so for me, thinking about the next 20 or 30 years in my career, and it was an opportunity to stand up and say, I value you, I value your health, your physical and emotional well-being, and here are some of the changes we're going to make. And then the last part is really just saying, as part of the health sector, we are doing harm. In the United States, 8.5% of greenhouse gas emissions is from the health sector. All of the plastic pollution, energy, heating, anesthetic gases, waste, food, nutrition, to provide care for patients and employees. The health sector is the largest employer in the United States. How do we continue to provide care for a growing number of people and aging population in the setting of the climate crisis? And that means widespread emission reductions and achieving net zero. So happy to speak more about that.
So as we all know, and as we've heard, climate change is here, and we're feeling it every day. And the first effects we notice are heat and floods and droughts. And these problems are being exacerbated before our eyes. Dry places are becoming drier, with droughts driving crop failure and livestock death and displacement of people. And wet places are becoming wetter, with flooding destroying communities and contaminating water supplies. And we're on the brink of a massive humanitarian crisis. 4 billion people today experience water insecurity. Another billion people on the earth don't have safe, clean drinking water at all. And by 2030, the United Nations projects that another 700 million people will be displaced because of water insecurity. So that's a lot of people. That's almost all of us, about 5 billion people facing water insecurity in one form or another. We see it here in the American West, in Boulder and throughout the American West, all the way to Mexico. We're in the third decade of a mega drought, the first in 1,500 years. The Colorado River is the lifeblood of the economy for 40 million people, and it's in danger of running dry. There's news about trying to address that finally just this week. In other places in the world, it's even more stark. You have 40 million people in East Africa facing food insecurity and even the risk of famine, as Karen pointed out. And then in still other places, there's lots of water, but it's contaminated. Diarrhea associated with dirty drinking water still kills millions and millions of people every year. 500,000 children under the age of 5 die from diarrhea associated with dirty drinking water every single year. And the people that are the most affected by climate change and the people that are the most affected by the impacts of climate change on water live in the places that are the least responsible for climate change. We cause climate change. The United States is the single greatest historic emitter of all time. China beats us annually, but not per person. Per capita, per person, we use and emit more to the atmosphere than anybody in the world, except for Qatar. And yet, everyone else in the world is feeling its effects. We, of course, have people impacted on their health by droughts and floods and heat stroke here in the US, but we also have hundreds of thousands, even millions of people dying from diarrhea around the world because of climate change.
Great. Well, thank you for those wonderful opening comments, Dr. Aguilar, Bailey, Rubee, and Thomas. I'd actually just like to give everybody an opportunity to, if anybody would like to respond to anybody's opening comments, we can start there.
I can just make a comment that it's just amazing to be here with you all. I think it's often very difficult to, how do we come across, not as experts of the field or people that have knowledge or something, but just as people, just as a person. I think throughout our histories, we got to wear many hats as students, as health professionals, as professors, as members of certain communities. But then again, these stories are so personal, and I do feel that everybody here, it's connecting and trying to connect with the audience as well. And we want to hear also from you, what do you think? And not only through this panel, but throughout this conference and through the rest of the opportunities we have to connect. I feel fortunate to be here with you all, and I think I sense a great energy coming from everybody here and from our panelists. So I just wanted to say that.
So I can respond to that. I gave you guys some pretty stark statistics a second ago. And for most of my career, the vast majority of my career, it's felt pretty hopeless. We were not taking climate action. We were not passing any laws. We were not passing a carbon tax. We were not changing our energy mix. We were neglecting the people that are the most affected by climate change, whether they live in LA or New Orleans or Mexico or Rwanda or Kenya or Denver. It was not a priority. Obviously, there are other priorities that our system had. And I teach, Karen does too, I teach a freshman class of engineers. Karen, you teach the freshman of environmental studies. And in both classes, we talk about climate change and the impact of climate change. And we talk about solutions, but the solutions were kind of evasive for a while. And a few years ago, I went in pretty heavy-handed with these stats. And, I could see on their faces that they're not only stricken, but also, they're not the ones that needed to have this impressed upon them. 18-year-olds have been living with this their entire lives already. They're not the ones that haven't taken action. They're not the ones that need to have it beaten into them about what climate change is. And for even until basically just the past couple of years, post-COVID, has there actually been clear movement in the United States government, in the COP27 that just happened, in actions by corporations with ESG commitments, technology advances like batteries and energy access, that now it actually seems like there's something we can do, and there's a way to direct people's climate anxiety into action. And that feels like, I don't know if anybody else has felt this, but that feels like a huge relief that there's actually action now.
Yeah, I would agree.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Karen.
I would absolutely agree. It is difficult. I say all the time to my students in our Intro to Environmental Studies class, we have to balance, sharing the data, which, as you heard, is not uplifting. It is depressing numbers across any sector where we're trying to quantify the impacts of climate change. But in order to address a problem, you have to understand it, You have to deeply understand the problem. So it does start with the data. But yes, I think the ability to point to specific solutions, to point to specific strategies, and to prompt and prime students to say, what are you good at? What do you have a passion for? And how does that intersect or interact with any of the different facets of climate change? And how can you go on in your career with your passions and make change is one way to sort of further uplift the conversation and keep it moving positively. One thing that I think also underlies everything that I teach, and I think everything that I aim to do, is this recognition of long, vast global histories, of miscarriages of justice, of inequity, of marginalization, of oppression, of colonialism, of racism, of sex, all of these things that are embedded into many of the systems that we're relying on to solve climate change. And so I think one important nuanced consideration is the ways in which climate adaptation itself, might be exacerbating existing inequity or existing injustice. So an example of this from our work in upstate New York is on flood adaptation. And so we're trying to understand how might buying up properties that have been flooded recently, probably several times in the last decade or so, and are likely to flood again, but how might that introduce inequity or exacerbate inequity into a community, How are renters being impacted, How are older people who have less access to resources and struggle more to move and relocate later in life? We're also looking at some of the ways it's disrupting relationships between communities and community members, and just the realities that even though we have solutions, we should really think critically about how they might interact with existing systems of inequity, to just bring us back down on the tail end there.
It's gonna be okay. I hope we challenge you all just with the wealth of expertise on this panel so that it's gonna be a lot. It's gonna be a lot. But we will talk about solutions. One thing just off the bat that you can do, have any of you asked your doctor about climate change? Oh, you can teach them a lot about that. Remember, you're clients too, right? What is your health system doing to address sustainability and climate change? What are members of your congregation or spiritual groups or your schools doing to increase green space? You can raise these questions anytime and have a profound impact.
So a number of you have alluded to policy and even economics of climate change, and so this is a jump ball to anybody. It's been argued that the most significant piece of climate legislation in U.S. history is called the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. And at face value, this might suggest that policymakers consider the health of the U.S. economy just as important as the health of our bodies and minds. So are there economic implications of the known threats to human health posed by climate change that should be included in policy considerations?
I can start with this one. Absolutely. So the Inflation Reduction Act is something we should all celebrate without a doubt. It has profound influence in getting resources to the places where they need it. There's a couple limitations, though. One is that there wasn't dedicated funding for health, per se. So the Office of Climate Change and Health Equity is an office through our U.S. government, and so they didn't really receive any funding through this. And so we have to be really deliberate when it comes to implementation as we move forward in coming years, ensuring that it gets to the right places. It gets to the inner city, most underserved people and groups, that it gets used in a manner that supports health and equity driven by data and research, not just thrown out. So that's one concern. From my standpoint, there was a report a couple years ago now, $800 billion in healthcare costs related to climate change and fossil fuel air pollution. And so really articulating getting away from fossil fuels as a way to support health and well-being, because inhalers cost money, right? I don't have to tell any of you all the pill bottles and prescriptions and unexpected ER visits and hospitalizations and all of these other things. Even a trip and fall causes a broken leg in an ER visit and unintended consequences, as well as transportation. So those are a few things that I think about. No doubt should be celebrated, but there's a lot for us to think about when it comes to actual implementation to ensure, as you mentioned, health and equity are supported.
So we're decades late in taking climate action, and it's better late than never. The Inflation Reduction Act, of course, and it is a huge source of optimism and opportunity. But that doesn't mean that the train hasn't already left the station, and a lot of people globally are going to be affected by it. People in the United States are being affected and will be affected and continue to be affected, and they will be the more marginalized among us. But again, globally, our problem pales in comparison to the people that are dying from climate change now, very explicitly. And the Inflation Reduction Act won't reach them. We need something a lot more significant than the Inflation Reduction Act. We need climate reparations. Again, we cause climate change. Everybody else in the world is feeling it. There are these historic factors that come in, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, with everything from slave trade to colonialism to imposed debt to trade agreements that are just totally unfair, and now climate change. So you're piling all these things on top of each other. And so the number of people without access to clean water in the world is increasing. The number of poor people in Africa living on less than $2 a day is increasing. The number of people displaced because of climate change is increasing. So there are positive indicators in some areas, but there are also regressive indicators elsewhere. The reason we haven't taken climate action before now is because of the United States is the biggest economy, the biggest emitter, and we're fiercely independent and capitalistic. And capitalism caused climate change. And we don't want things taken away from us. And so part of the reason it took so long is it took a long time for activists and policymakers who wanted to take action to finally get to incentives instead of taxes. The Inflation Reduction Act didn't pass because of Joe Manchin. It passed because it is a massive amount of money that's going to be handed out to pay people to do the right thing. So it's probably not the best answer, but it might be one of our only answers we have right now, is actually using capitalism to try to cure the major ill of capitalism. It's too late for other ideas, unfortunately. We had a chance in the 90s for a carbon tax, but we didn't take it.
I might be a little less pessimistic than Evan, only because I have to be, I think, emotionally. Another just important consideration, I think, again, when thinking about both how we implement climate adaptation efforts, and particularly in international settings, is just today in my class on human-environment interactions in the African context, I was talking about what development is and how it operates, and I had two case studies of sort of a successful development implementation, actually, that Evan's involved with, bridges to prosperity, right? Improving access to essential services, to markets, to medical care by building footbridges, so that particularly when there's flooding events, right, people can still get where they need to go to buy food, to sell their food, their farm products, et cetera. That was the success. The sort of counter example, I don't know if anybody's heard of it. It's called play pumps. So yeah, it was established in East Africa, and the idea was essentially to use merry-go-rounds to pump water from boreholes and wells. And the idea was children play, people get water. And people love this idea, right? Clinton gave a ton of money, Bush gave a ton of money, Jay-Z gave a ton of money. It was well funded, right? But then it didn't work, right? There were concerns about children being paid to play, relying on child labor, certainly concerns around maintenance, but perhaps the biggest issue of all, they replaced the regular hand pumps with merry-go-rounds, so that in order to access the water, you had to push a merry-go-round. And it's like, again, on the face of it, perhaps a good idea, but wildly problematic execution. So all that to say, there's a need to consider the context, right? To consider the culture, to consider the area, to consider the reality, and empower communities who are most impacted, right? To use funds in the way that they think they should be directed, as opposed to letting, wealthy Westerners, for example, decide what development looks like.
And I would like to comment on that, because it's a great segue into how do we communicate what's going on in the experiences we are living through. Because it's very easy to try to come up with solutions, but if we don't know the community well enough, if we're not providing any context, we might just stumble into solutions that are actually worse than the problems that we're trying to solve in the first place. And I think in that, just fostering collaboration between institutions, between people within the community, between other organizations, it's gonna be able to bridge a little bit more. We are decades late into taking action, but at the same time, there is opportunity right now, because everybody's seeing it, and we're starting to realize, okay, what are we gonna do about it, and what else can be done? For example, something that I really enjoyed from the Paso del Norte region is that for air quality, there's our joint advisory committee that actually has public officials from Ciudad Juarez in Mexico, El Paso in Texas, and Las Cruces in New Mexico. So those collaborations even go beyond what's allowable in some institutions, because they're not supposed to be some cross collaboration, but they do it anyway, just because air pollution, air quality affects everybody in general, regardless of the physical border that it's just there. So I think there's an opportunity to start bridging that, and it's great to see that these agreements between nations are thinking more about that. The world is more connected now than ever, and it's an opportunity as well to, as individuals, start thinking about, well, how do we start making those connections work towards solutions as well?
Great. And just as a reminder, I see lots of questions being jotted down. Please don't be shy. Raise your hand and you'll get a note card to write down your question. It'll be collected and so on. So keep them coming. we will have plenty of time for questions very shortly. So let's see. A recent study by Mora et al. Published last August in Nature Climate Change found that 58% of infectious diseases confronted by humanity worldwide have been aggravated by climate hazards already. So what do you view as the role of local governments in mitigating this threat multiplier of climate change and health?
I can start. So it really comes down to this local to global perspective that each and every one of us can have. So one is identifying local infectious disease risk factors and the spread of them. So human mobility now is easier than ever before. And so with that, for example, in my emergency department, I need to think of a global population of diseases and infections for my patients. It's not uncommon to see patients displaced and coming from all parts of the Afro region, for example, or Pakistan or Afghanistan. We've seen quite a few refugees there. I need to think about what waterborne infections they're exposed to, and it's across the lifespan. Certainly we talk about children frequently because death is much higher, especially under age 5, related to diarrheal illness and all of these other conditions, but infections are a driver. So in order to treat them, we need to identify them. So that makes sure, number one, physician education and clinician education. Number 2 is testing in a timely manner. And I don't need to explain to any of you about what happened with COVID, right? So some of these infections, you can send a test off and get results in 2 months. Well, that's not very helpful when it comes to reducing spread and risk to others. And then the third thing is treatments. So some of these infections you treat with just IV fluids and its supportive care. Where do IV fluids come from? So some of you may be aware when Hurricane Maria hit, Puerto Rico was the largest producer of IV fluids for the United States. And we saw shortages well over a year that affected our day-to-day clinical practice. Compound that with heat and people needing IV hydration for heat and increased care for that. And this is where we have all of the competing interests. Fortunately, a lot goes into preparing our facilities, including in low and middle income settings and island nations. So I partner with the African Federation of Emergency Medicine. They have a group of emergency clinicians on the continent, and we're really working on disaster preparedness. And so as we develop emergency care, we're doing so with a mindset of what does climate conscious care delivery look like? And that is one of the most exciting pieces for me. What happens if we can get renewable energy and electrification to all health facilities on the African continent? Many of my colleagues say, yeah, I diagnosed appendicitis, but we do not have lights in the operating theater that can run so that I can perform the surgery. We do it by the window and I can only operate during the day. What does it look like if we have continuous energy and lights in these facilities? If we have clean water for the youngest and the oldest in these communities, even during times of disasters? And these hospitals or health facilities can really be safety nets during times of flood, during cholera outbreaks, during food insecure times. And then the last part is going off of what was said earlier, really thinking on a broader scale of early warning systems. So that would be something to read up on if you haven't yet, but thinking about food preparation, and there are food early warning systems, food being the most basic medicine in some ways. Early warning systems that prepare the local community and allow sharing of resources with our global community to ensure that we as global citizens are taking care of each other.
So to build off of that, these stories of hospitals that don't have clean water, don't have electricity, it's a parable, and it's not just a question of providing technology or providing money. at one point, there are major, major barriers to providing sustained services. You know, water is not trivial. Energy is not trivial. Sanitation is not trivial. It is extremely complex to provide those services and very, very, very expensive. Here in Boulder, we have a lot of water. We actually have plenty of water here. We have infrastructure that's been bought and paid for years ago. We have an extremely rich, not very densely populated city. And yet when each of you and I pay our water bill, we're only paying about 60% of the cost of delivering water to ourselves. We have extremely subsidized services. And yet the international development community, which is filled with people like me and Karen, don't internalize how we're delivering services here, and we instead go to a place like Eswatini or Kenya or Rwanda and dictate or suggest that, you know, there might be a technology barrier, here's the technology, there might be a one-time capital expense, here's the money, but otherwise you got to pay for it yourself. You know, we use words that sound nice like capacity building and local ownership, but really we're talking about withholding the necessary assets to deliver these basic services. There is an emerging opportunity to try to address this, and it links some of the ideas we've talked about today, and that's the burgeoning world of what's called ESG commitments, environment, social, and governance commitments, mostly by U.S. corporations. You've all heard of this, of course, and one of the mechanisms is a thing called a carbon credit, where companies will buy carbon credits to offset their own emissions. They can buy those credits from projects delivering water, delivering energy, delivering sanitation, delivering healthcare around the world. It's a imperfect, highly imperfect form of reparations and payments on a more sustained basis than the current status quo. Now, again, it's not perfect. Taking a carbon credit from Microsoft in many ways looks and feels better than just taking a donation from the Gates Foundation. The origin of capital is the same, and it's still at the whims of people in Seattle. But the carbon finance and the climate finance markets at least offer what could be a more sustainable financing stream to subsidize services globally.
I wanted to add a little bit more of what was said. Specifically, Caitlin, you were talking about how infectious diseases is also a big part of where the hospitals and the treatment are needed. And I wanted to include also the prevention efforts that are needed also on the long term. I think politically it's very easy for a government to focus on the short term because they might not be thinking, okay, what's going to happen in a decade or two? What are going to be the effects that we're seeing of the environmental issues? How particle pollution, lead in the water, asbestos in the buildings are going to lead to chronic diseases, to cancer, to diabetes, because they might not see those effects within their administrations or even within their lifespans. And how can we turn that into, okay, we need to start thinking about the broad spectrum. I think we're doing a great effort in communicating what needs to be done in order to protect vulnerable communities, but still there's a lot that needs to go into funding that and also researching about it, because we still have a lot to learn. I think the experience with COVID brought a lot of awareness about how something unknown can really quickly change our livelihood. But that also created more awareness about, okay, now that this is happening, I want to learn more about other health outcomes that might be affected. And I think this drives a lot of the motivation about learning about climate change. And the next step is how can we influence local policymakers and local governments. And it starts with just having those conversations, making sure that if you want to be involved within your communities, look for those people that are doing some of the efforts, or maybe even get involved within government or talking to government officials, because they might not be aware of all of this. And also a great point about talking to your physician, your medical providers. As a physician, to be honest, I wasn't trained in a lot of these things. I didn't know much about environmental issues or even nutrition issues, and it is often assumed that physicians and medical providers know about every topic, and it is not true. And most of the source of knowledge comes directly from the patients. And I think this is just a great opportunity to also drive that discussion to it becomes a more sharing of knowledge between two parties.
Yeah, I think maybe building on a lot of the points that have been raised, when I think about sort of what local governments are or possibly should be doing, I think about it as kind of the need for improved collaboration and sort of sharing of information, knowledge, resources, lessons learned, et cetera, and more holistic thinking about the reality that climate change is a threat multiplier, right? That's often how it's described. It interacts and intersects with every aspect of our lived experience, right? So when we're thinking about solutions, we need to think about all those interactions in as many ways as we possibly can. And at the level of local government, I think sharing of information, communicating information, right? Sharing infrastructure, access to resources, et cetera, across those local governments and doing it in a holistic sort of systems thinking way can be really powerful. And it does make me think of one of the perhaps silver linings of the pandemic is the rapid pathway, right? The time it took to develop a vaccine, and the reality that was accelerated in part due to ongoing research, but largely because we were sharing data. Medical professionals and scientists were collaborating globally in a way that we really haven't seen done effectively up until that moment in time. So thinking about how we can build the infrastructure to facilitate ongoing collaboration across local governments up to different scales of government, up to international governments, I think it's really important, not only for getting the funding we need to make things happen, but also just to come up with solutions that understand the interactions and intersections of all these things.
So just so you all know, these panelists did not have my questions in advance. They're actually just that good. Okay, so we've had a number of really good questions brought up to me, and I suggest that we actually just go straight to the Q&A. I love some of these. There are a couple cards here that more or less ask this question, so I'm just going to ask straight off of one of them. So what do you say to climate change skeptics who are fighting necessary changes, i.e. politicians? That was the less spicy version of the question.
I love this question. I do, and I love health policy, and I have lived in Ohio and Wisconsin, now Colorado, all over, and it really comes down to finding common ground. For me, it's easy. Health is common ground. But there's also a lot of other nonpartisan common ground areas. For example, telehealth, increasing access, especially in rural areas, supporting farmers with agricultural practices and subsidies that support local nutritious foods that not only support health and well-being, but also support the families and the financial interests of those farmers and agricultural communities. I'm going to Washington, D.C. for the second time this month to talk with policymakers. And a lot of it is education, because this is a lot. I hope this is a lot for some of you. This is still a lot for any one of us. And it's a lifelong skill, really, to continue to learn and grow in this dynamic field. But I can tell you that just in talking with these individuals, it goes a long way. And so if you have not had the opportunity to reach out to your own local or national policymaker, talk to them. Just say, here are the facts. You don't have to provide testimony necessarily or write a letter to the editor, although love that too. But it goes a long way in helping connect the dots on what the climate crisis means for you as an individual, for our community, and our shared vision of what we want our community to look like. And that goes a long way. Now, on an international scale, the United Nations Climate Change Conference occurs usually November or December. I have gone the last 3 years, and it is not without significant angst in knowing all the carbon emissions I'm giving, but it is the fact that I'm part of several hundred clinician climate and health delegates from around the world who are talking with the nearly 200 negotiators and many more NGOs and policymakers to say climate change is about health. What are you doing? What can we do? What can we help with to change our monetary system, to address engineering and infrastructure concerns, to put population health first and foremost? And that goes along with addressing gender. It goes along with addressing lower resource communities and individuals, and people who have underlying medical conditions that are at increased risk of getting really sick related to air pollution, heat, and other exposures.
I tend to think about this at sort of multiple scales. And I think the smallest scale being the interpersonal relationships where these conversations might show up and frustrate us and things like that. And so in those contexts, I definitely really strongly rely on the finding common ground and really, seeking first to understand, then to be understood. Which I think is just important with difficult conversations and communicating around and through and within conflict in general. I think the other piece that's important is, and I often quote the science writer Ed Young, who wrote for The Atlantic, he's at least the first person I heard say this, you can't replace a feeling with a fact. Right? And so the numbers are real, the data is real, right? I share it, I quote it, I teach it. But I think there's again, especially at this fine scale, small scale interpersonal relationships, I'm probably not going to change a strong feeling, right? A strong emotional connection, a strong story with numbers, right? So sharing stories, sharing narratives, and this is part of why I do increasingly incorporate research around storytelling, around connections to place, around interpersonal relationships into my climate change research to be able to uplift those stories. And I think when you are able to exchange those stories, you find that common ground. We recognize the myriad of ways that the climate is changing, even if we're not necessarily calling it that. And we can think through solutions collaboratively, ideally.
I think it's just amazing. This reminded me of a story as Caitling was sharing, that talking to public officials, to staffers, it's just very challenging depending on who you're talking to. I was with Climate Health Now, a California organization for physicians, and they had the opportunity to offer physicians to talk to staffers from very different senators. And back then there was like, well, you're originally from Texas. Why don't you try talking to the staffers from Texas senators? And I was like, okay, now I'll do my best. And as you might wonder, there were senators from very different political spectrums. I don't need to mention names, but it was very interesting because as I engaged with some of the staffers, the whole group had prepared an apolitical statement where as physicians and clinicians, we recognize that climate change is here, that there's a need to drive change and turn it into action. And I was pleasantly surprised that some of the staffers were really engaged and were even thinking about solutions on how to communicate it better. Because there were a couple of points where we would say something and the staffers in me were like, oh, the senator's not gonna like this, or like he very likely agrees, but I don't think he can admit to this and that. But then eventually that common ground starts to happen, like, oh, he's definitely interested in transportation and how better infrastructure can come in as a solution towards the air pollution. So let's try blending that into the conversation. So you can find ways to interact with people because at one point we're all in it together, and as Karen was so eloquently saying, a feeling is very strong. So we need to start bringing back that into the conversations. We need to engage others and be open, being willing to understand, to acknowledge the feelings, and try to sometimes breathe in to the things that we might be listening in, and also share our stories and try to find a perspective where it's not easy to change the mindset of someone that might be skeptic, but it can be done as we continue to approach everyone and be open about it. And we've seen it throughout time. We're seeing more awareness, more interest, and now even more action. So that means that people are trying to learn more about it. So we have that opportunity. It is challenging, but we can do this even if it is one person at a time.
Okay.
Oh, I just want to quickly make a quick plug, if you're interested in this topic particularly, for my colleague's research, Matt Burgess, over in Environmental Studies, who specifically studies political polarization and the ways in which certain bills might be more or less likely to pass depending on how they're framed, right? And so to finding common ground, right, when you frame climate change around food and food security, more people get on board, right, than when you frame it around different ways. So his research is really, I think, shedding a lot of light on how to communicate, particularly in Senate context, for example. Oh, Google Matt Burgess, CU Boulder, Burgess. Sorry. Also, if you want to come chat with me afterwards, I can send you to a website.
So a little pivot here, but I think this one might be probably directed toward my new MD friends up here. The question is, how are pregnant women being affected by the climate crisis?
I can jump straight into that. We had a research project while I was doing my postdoc at Stanford, looking specifically at the effects of air pollution and what it meant for pregnant women. We were very interested in learning how the specific average of pollution was affecting the health in women that were in a community where the high levels of pollution has been throughout many years. But the focus now becomes, okay, there's a lot of research in regards to the outcomes. We know that it's bad for the children, for the babies as they're developed, but now we're learning more about what it means for the mothers as well. So Kari Nato is leading this fantastic project related to air pollution and immune tolerance. And we're starting to see that the immune system, basically during pregnancy, we know that as it's preparing to host the fetus as it's developing, the immune system is basically on a lower setting, where it's more susceptible to the effects of environmental exposures. So it becomes critical to notice that sometimes the recommendations about certain levels of exposure to certain pollutants or environmental hazards are not the same throughout the spectrum. There are populations that are at a higher risk, with pregnant women being one of them. So it is important to consider this when writing policy, when talking about specific populations. Climate change and all its consequences doesn't affect everybody the same, and we need to be mindful of that.
Another study to point out is one by Dr. Bekkar, Bekkar. Essentially, it was a systematic review looking at heat and air pollution exposure, and there was an increase in low birth weight and preterm births. And this was, again, thousands and thousands of births. I deal with a lot of miscarriages. Another consideration is access to oral contraceptive pills. For example, during times of disaster and any sort of reproductive means, women kind of lose access to any of that. And there's also an increase in gender-based violence during these times. And so things like rape, sexual violence, domestic violence increase in the setting of disaster globally. And this is something, again, we hear a lot in emergency settings, as well as with our OBGYN colleagues.
Okay. So here's another question from the audience. Investing in companies that are not killing the planet is the best way to protect the planet. How can we screen good companies in this way? A timely question around here, actually.
So it's a great question, and it's a really tricky question. There's I mentioned a second ago ESG, and ESG is not what you think it is, and it's not what most people think it is, and it's not what the people attacking it think it is. ESG originally, and as actually embodied by the indices that rate companies on their ESG compliance, is about the risk of the environment and society and governance issues to the company. It's not about the company's impact on the world. And that's been horribly misrepresented by everybody. So much so that the definition is kind of changing and it gets confusing about what it is. But that's why Tesla is relatively low rated on ESG, even though EVs are unequivocally good for at least climate change. There's other problems with them. And Chevron is relatively highly rated on their ESG rating because Chevron is doing things to adapt to the risk that their bottom line faces, not what they're doing to the world's bottom line. So ESG ratings actually are not a particularly good metric of whether or not a company is taking climate action, which is really strange because there's a bunch of people attacking it thinking that that's what it is. And like the state of Texas is doing things like barring, the state government from investing in indices that report ESG. Like it's not what they're saying it is. So instead, there's other things to look at. There's a lot of the voluntary mechanisms for what are called net zero commitments. So corporations saying that they will be net zero. They're voluntary commitments. They don't have to do it. But you see a lot of leading companies like everybody from Delta Airlines to Microsoft to Netflix saying that they will be net zero emissions. And they do that by changing their own practices and then often buying the difference either through offsets, which are carbon credits, or insets, which is the same thing but changing how their supply chain operates. You have to dig this information up, and there's really inconsistent metrics. There's different qualities of carbon credits. The carbon markets are, sorry, not to go down too far the rabbit hole of carbon credits, but it's kind of my thing. There's a bunch of weird, perverse stuff happening in carbon finance right now, including if you are the most committed to the most unobjectively truthful carbon credit, you want to buy direct air capture. You want the Spaceballs vacuum cleaner sucking. Some of you have seen Spaceballs, right? Sucking, the carbon dioxide out of the air. This is the least thermodynamically, least energetically, least environmentally, and kind of the most perverse way of addressing climate change is after the fact. Whereas probably the most environmentally friendly, thermodynamically efficient way of generating carbon credits is things like tree planting or other nature-based solutions, which suffer from measurement problems. It's really hard to prove that they're working. It's really hard to prove that it would have happened if you hadn't had the incentive. So I'm not really answering the question. It's an evolving market. It's a moving target. There's a lot of agitation and energy and uncertainty in how corporations will pay to address the climate damages that they're causing. But it's certainly exciting. You're seeing stuff about it almost every day.
I think it's just a helpful reminder that the default in any setting, right, is often the least environmentally friendly. It's also probably the least, right, ethically friendly in terms of labor conditions, et cetera. So there's important to recognize that it requires a ton of work on our part as consumers to do, right, to figure out what exactly Netflix is doing. Right? It requires, they're not making it super obvious or easy to find, and that goes for really any institution. So all that to say, it's important to be aware. It's important to do as much research as you possibly can, but right, recognizing that corporations, by virtue of this reality, are putting a lot of work and a lot of onus on the individual consumer. And so I do think that's where political methods that make some of these things perhaps less voluntary and more required and require them to be visible are also ways to do some of that work. And then I would just also make a comment about, not just where we're buying things, but also other, right, like the University of Colorado Boulder is having a town hall next week on its climate action plan, right? Institutions everywhere are taking action or making plans to take action, and they need to be held accountable, right? And community members like you are really critical for holding an institution like CU Boulder accountable. I'm on the climate action plan. I strongly am in favor of accountability on the steering committee, right? And so that's another way to just think about how we can show up and have action in our communities.
Maybe you could comment more about your point earlier about 8.6% of emissions are from the healthcare system. How do we address that?
Yeah. So I think thinking of university and the hospital as businesses as well. Yeah. So certainly universities setting divesting from fossil fuels, and the same goes for health systems. There have been health systems that achieved energy independence. Gunderson Health back in 2014, I believe. And so they thought about this, They said this is part of our mission and vision, and this is what we're going to do. Health and Human Services has a pledge going on right now, and they're trying to get different health systems to join. Right now, there's more than 100 organizations who have already committed to essentially halving their emissions by 2030 and achieving net zero by 2050, with the goal to, again, collaborate, get all of these different regions and these different organizations together. There's a lot of heterogeneity within this, but you as community members, as patients, can have a significant voice in nudging these systems to do that. Because what happens is there's these CEOs, which are business leaders, and traditionally they aren't very well versed in everything we've been talking about. And so really helping them understand what this means for health and well-being, and what this means for not only employee recruitment and retention, but also for high quality patient care and supporting the air quality within their community is really important.
Well, let's go back to water for a minute. So this question reads: the majority of water used in Boulder County comes from Trans Mountain diversion via the CBT Big Thompson diversion. How are we protecting the environment of where this water should be going by protecting our health with diverted water? And we have a couple of water experts, local water experts on the panel, so that's great.
I don't know if any of us are water experts. Yeah, I think the majority of the ways, we're getting a signal, that we're thinking about protecting our water quality here in the state of Colorado is, in addition, right, to advocating for the state of Colorado in all the Colorado water law conversations that are happening, it's really protecting the surrounding landscape, right? Recognizing that the health of water is significantly influenced by the health of the ecosystem, right, within which, right, the water flows. And so looking at tree health, looking at ecosystem diversity, right, looking at soil health in all of these places, and protecting and managing and moderating landscape use in that area to support water quality, I think is the primary approach. Development tends to be a threat to that, and so also considering that piece is really important in thinking about our water sources here in the state and really globally.
The challenge with, you all heard of that, or I think most of you heard of the Colorado River Compact. So the Colorado River starts right over the hills. The Big Thompson Project brings some of that water here to Denver. Boulder actually gets its water from, well, actually not from Gross Reservoir, from Nederland mostly. Gross Reservoir is for Denver as well. The big users of water are, of course, cities and agriculture and livestock. And cities are actually not really the big problem. You know, we see urbanization, and we see things like grass growing and pools and these kind of things. The big use of water is for ag and livestock, and we're growing alfalfa in the desert, using mined water. We're pumping about half of the water we use for ag is groundwater, which was accumulated over between thousands and millions of years. We're doing it everywhere from here all the way into California. In the Central Valley of California, they're literally mining water, you know, like they're mining gold. It's a non-renewable resource in the way that they're using it to grow almonds to ship to China. It's just not the best use of water. So while aridification is happening, I mean, so we have this drought. Really, it's probably not a drought. It's aridification, both cyclical and because of climate change. There's still plenty of water. There's still plenty of water. We're just not using it for its best use. And one of the reasons we haven't been using it for its best use is because of these relatively ancient laws around water rights and seniority of water rights and the Colorado River Compact, all of which seemed like these impossibly immovable objects that we entirely invented. And just yesterday, or the day before yesterday, the White House said, we're going to throw all that out, and we're just going to force you to use less water. And that probably will come into effect in June, because we are within 30 feet of no more water running through the Hoover Dam. It's called dead pool, which is a pretty scary kind of little vocab. Dead pool. We're within 30 feet of dead pool. And if we don't unstick this, there's just no more water anymore. And then on the water quality side, as Karen was saying, water quality is getting worse. Urbanization, climate change, wildfires are a huge contributor, soil erosion, use of fertilizers, all of these things is and on the medical side, things like, birth control ending up in the water. All of these things are making water quality worse. And we usually need to build more and more and more infrastructure that is energy intensive to clean up that water. But it's not the only way of doing it. The other way is with green infrastructure, as Karen said. We can actually clean up the water in the watersheds.
I would just add 2 other points. One is thinking about hydropower as well. And so thinking about different forms of energy up front now, so we don't just rely on water, because when the water goes down, then you lose power. The second component is thinking about, we can all picture Earth, right? More than 70% of Earth is blue. Of that, somewhere around 1.5% of water is actually drinkable. And where does a lot of that come from? Fresh water. The Great Lakes are a great source. So if you haven't, there are actually some really nice compacts across states in the region there that protect that water. And so as someone who grew up along the shores of Lake Superior, that is near and dear to my heart, and thinking about where is the fresh water on this planet, and how even in these dry periods where those resource constraints are going to come from, and what potential conflict that could cause, and how we can think about having secure policies now to ensure that processes are in place.
Great. Well, I'm under strict instruction to get us out of here on time, and so I'm going to actually ask this last question, but I think it's actually a nice statement disguised as a question, and it was, are political science students required to take science classes on climate change? So we don't have time to actually answer that question, but I appreciated that question greatly, as many of us are faculty here. And so why don't we thank our panelists. And thank you, everybody, for coming. Enjoy the rest of the Conference on World Affairs.
Nice to meet you.
You too, yeah.
Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs, and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.